right, let's go to our guest line. Bring on our first guest today. If you happen to be watching us at QSportsTalk.com, you see our first guest live and in person as we are joined now by Matt Present, the voice of Appalachian State basketball, to fill us in on Luke Wilson. And, Matt, a lot of folks around here excited that Syracuse finally has a center at number one. What can you tell us about this young man? What does he bring to the table?
Yeah, first, appreciate you guys having me on. Luke's a really interesting player and an interesting story, I think. Grew up playing football primarily, more so than basketball. He didn't really get into basketball until high school. And even at that point, he was still playing football, and he was getting Division I football offers. And it wasn't until late in the recruiting process that he decided he wanted to go to the basketball route. And so he redshirted his first year at App State. But I preface all that to say that, like, his basketball game is really good, but in the grand scheme of Division I basketball players, it's still in its infancy. And so I think we saw Luke take a huge step forward this past season at App State, where he turned into just a double-double machine. But to me, there's so much potential in his game to become a dominant post player, a guy that really finishes a lot around the rim. Certainly, he's proven that he can dunk the ball, he can block the ball, he can rebound the ball. But in terms of developing that finesse around the rim, to me, that's the next step. And he certainly showcased his ability to develop over the last couple of years.
You know, when we look at his profile on paper, I think it reminds us a lot of SU center from last year, William Kyle. 6'9", was Defensive Player of the Year at South Dakota State before he went to UCLA. Didn't play much at UCLA and then came here and just had a high motor, was super athletic. The fact that you're saying he could have played football or basketball in college at a Division I level, I would assume he's very athletic. Do you feel like he kind of fits that bill from an athleticism standpoint?
Yeah, I think without question, just in terms of his body type, he came into App State at 285 pounds and worked with our strength coach, Connor Agnew, when he redshirted as a freshman, got down to about 255. And then this past year was his first season starting on a regular basis. And to me, what impressed me most, in addition to the double-double numbers, was the fact that he was often on the court 30-plus minutes. So a guy that can get up and down, guy that can play a lot of minutes, and that also shows that he's staying out of foul trouble. And so when you have a guy at that size who, by and large, is able to play that many minutes and do it for the most part foul-free, I think speaks to his motor, but also just kind of his smarts in how he plays.
You know, one of the other things that we've seen with Jerry McNamara building this roster, and Jerry laid this out for us a couple weeks ago when he spoke to the media after getting the job, he talked about that, he wanted high-character guys, not just players who are going to come in and be invested on the defensive end, which it sounds like Luke Wilson is, but he wants, good young men on and off the court. Can you speak to, I guess, the kind of, teammate he is, the kind of student he is, just the overall package that is Luke Wilson that you got to witness over the course of the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone on this year's App State team got along really well, spent a lot of time together, not only on the court, but all gravitated towards one another off the court. And so while that doesn't necessarily speak to Luke in particular, I think that when you have a team that is as connected as this year's group was, it speaks to all of the individuals. And certainly he's a big part of that, a guy that was on App State for 3 years. And at the mid-major level in 2026, there isn't a lot of guys who are staying 3 or 4 seasons, even if you include a redshirt. But he was one of those guys that was a culture piece this year. I think in terms of kind of academics and interests off the basketball court, he's talked about wanting to get into real estate when his basketball career is over. So I thought that was pretty interesting and unique.
You look at the mid-major, situation now as it pertains to the rest of college basketball. And, Paulie brought this up the other day on our show about how it feels like, the mid-majors in some ways are becoming feeder programs to the bigger schools. And I guess, can you speak to that aspect of where things are right now from an App State perspective about, guys come there, they have some success, and then they're looking for a bigger payday and they want to go play Power 4, and then they end up leaving, and you don't kind of get to see their careers through. You get to see the beginning of their career, but not necessarily the finished product. I guess, can you speak to that aspect of it, working at a mid-major, and what that's like for a school like App State?
Yeah, it's a really fair question. I don't know that I have a perfect answer because I think it's so case by case. I mean, certainly there's guys that are transferring within the Power Four from one school to another. I think there's guys that sometimes are maybe role players at a P4 that might come down to a mid-major level to try to have a full season of starting to end their career. So certainly there's some players like Luke who might, as they ascend, try to jump up to that higher level. And you're happy for them on a personal level. You're also a little bit disappointed in terms of the program itself that you don't have that player and that talent once it's been developed continuing on in your program. But certainly, one of App State's all-conference players from the year prior, Miles Tate, began his career at Butler, and some injuries and coaching changes. And quite frankly, he'd tell you probably just wasn't quite talented enough to be a starter at Butler, but comes to App State and is an all-conference player. So I think that it can work both ways. But I do think it's challenging, and I think there was a lot of discourse around the NCAA tournament this past year and what does that mean for Cinderella going forward. And I think one of the biggest strengths historically of mid-majors is that you get guys who are in a program together for 4 seasons and get to know each other and the way they play together so well. And that's what's helped a lot of these mid-majors historically to win some games against some high-level Power 4 or 5 teams. And so I think it's that's a challenge. And it's not just a challenge at the mid-major level, but it's a challenge across college basketball, is to find a way to get your guys to play well together when it's so year to year.
I realize this next question, there's a lot of speculation with it, but when you look at some of the other schools that were after him, Georgia, Mississippi State, UCLA, Purdue, I know was in on him early. Do you have a feel for kind of what separated Syracuse from the rest of the pack for Luke Wilson? Why did Syracuse win out on his recruitment? Was it the chance to most likely be the starting center, at an ACC school? What do you think ultimately, led to the commitment of Luke Wilson going to Syracuse?
Yeah, I really don't know. I'll be honest, I didn't follow his recruitment a whole lot. I'd heard UCLA thrown out there, but the schools that you listed off, I honestly wasn't really aware of who was following him once he went in the portal. Certainly, I was interested to see where he landed, but yeah, I mean, certainly playing time is always a factor, but I don't really know for sure.
In terms of his ceiling as a player, can you compare him to anyone, whether somebody in the NBA or a Power 4 player that you feel like, his game, is modeled after? Does he remind you of anyone?
That's a good question. I don't know that anyone comes to mind right off in terms of a comparison. To me, I'm really high on what he can be at Syracuse. And certainly I think there's going to be some degree of adjustment with just the natural size and physicality that he'll see at that level relative to what he saw at the Sun Belt level. But I think once he adjusts to that, the shot blocking is a natural ability. I think for him, that's not really something you teach. He's a guy who's reacting. He's timing it up. He's not, having to learn that part of his game. And that right there is so valuable. He's a good rebounder by trade. So I think when you have those pieces in place, the opportunity for him to develop in the skill set around the rim offensively, certainly he's going to give you a lot of energy with his style of play. And when he throws down some big dunks, that's going to, for the folks in the stands, it's going to be energizing. It's going to be fun to watch that. But I think just what I've seen in his progression on the offensive end, he was not a great free throw shooter last year. This year, he was a little bit better and went through stretches at the end of the year where that area started to grow. And so when you get a guy who is going to play physically down low and hopefully continue to round out his offensive game, if the free throw numbers keep getting better, he could legitimately be a 20 and 10 kind of guy.
Last question from me. When you look at Luke Wilson, you said that he could certainly block shots, he could certainly finish around the rim, he could certainly rebound. Well, one issue at times last year with the Syracuse team was defending the pick and roll. Can you give us an idea of how he's able to, I guess, defend the pick and roll? Is he athletic enough to hedge out and get back? Does he normally just drop back into the paint because he's a natural shot blocker? Can you give us an idea where things stand with his defense, especially on the pick and roll game?
Yeah, I mean, he's not a guy who's going to switch and take on the guard, but he certainly is a guy that with his quickness and length, he can get out and hard hedge, and he can show and try to force that guard to slow his course around the screen or reverse kind of and slow down the play. But yeah, when he's at his best, I think it is drop coverage and protecting the paint and trying to deter the drive or the lob.
All right, Matt. Sounds like Syracuse is getting a good one in Luke Wilson. We very much appreciate the time today. Thanks so much for coming on.
Of course. Thank you, guys.
All right, Matt Present, the voice of Appalachian State basketball.